In systems engineering and in project management, the requirements definition process begins with the elicitation of stakeholder requirements. The first step of which is to identify the stakeholders from whom we're going to gather those requirements. It's common, particularly in project management, to define a stakeholder as anyone who has a stake in the system being developed by the project. That is, anyone who's going to be affected by that system in some way, or anyone who can affect the system in some way. Now, in most systems, this definition is just not useful, because it's often very difficult to find someone who is not affected by the system. Whilst we must take into account all those who are affected by, or who can affect the system, those people are not necessarily or automatically stakeholders. For example, we hope that our competitor's business is going to be seriously affected by the introduction of our new product, but that doesn't make the competitor a stakeholder. In fact, far from it. We hope that they'll not be aware of the product until it's released and their business begins to suffer, or rather, ours at least begins to flourish. So just because someone is affected by the project doesn't make them a stakeholder in that project. Stakeholders are the owners of the problem at the business operations level. They are the people from whom we elicit needs and requirements, and then from whom we obtain the input necessary during requirements analysis to assist in tasks such as trade studies. Their input to the system lifecycle is crucial. Careful selection of appropriate stakeholders is therefore fundamental to the success of the project. It follows that if we choose a different set of stakeholders, we'll almost likely end up with a different set of system requirements, and therefore a different system. It's essential that the major stakeholders are nominated by business management. It's not reasonable for business management to pass their needs and requirements down to the business operations level and then let those at that level decide amongst themselves who are to be the stakeholders of the system. Strictly speaking, a stakeholder could be defined as someone who has a stake in the project. That is, someone who's affected by the system in some way or can affect the system in some way. However, the identification of stakeholders can't simply be listing those who have or perceive themselves to have a stake in the project. In most systems, this is not useful since it's often difficult to find someone who's not affected by the system in some way. For example, even in a simple system such as an automatic teller machine network, there may be millions of stakeholders if we use such a general definition. And that's also true in committee-based organisations such as the public service, where the number of potential stakeholders is literally enormous. So we can't progress with such a definition of the people from whom which you should elicit requirements. First, because there are so many, we can't possibly have the time to engage with everyone who have an involvement in the new system, even if we only restrict ourselves to representatives of selected groups. Second, it assumes that anyone affected by the system is actually a source of requirements. Our competitors will be affected, for example. We're not going to ask them what they would like to see in the new system, although we will of course always take them into account. Additionally, it would mean that anyone who wants to have a say should be able to influence requirements. We would therefore be at the mercy of the stakeholders who want to contribute requirements, whether they're useful or not. And finally, the new system will have disparate effects on stakeholders. They'll not be affected equally, and they should not have equal rights in expressing requirements. No complex system can be optimal to all parties concerned, nor can all functions be optimised. The first step in identifying stakeholders is therefore much more complicated than simply listing all those who could be considered to have a stake in the new system. We need to do that, but we must restrict ourselves to the owners of the problem and of the solution presented by the new system. We certainly do need to take into account anyone who is affected by the new system when we're considering requirements, but that doesn't mean that they are stakeholders. For example, when considering the design of an ATM system, the armed guards who distribute cash around the system are clearly important actors. However, they're not stakeholders. They're actors whose actions the system must be designed to support. So more usefully, a stakeholder is defined as someone who has the right to influence the outcome of the system, rather than someone who is simply affected by the system. Now, even our better definition doesn't assist in identifying who the stakeholders are automatically. If a stakeholder has a right to influence the requirements, we need to identify what or who gives them that right. Now, even then, as we discussed in the previous section, we need to examine candidate stakeholders more carefully. For example, do all stakeholders have equal rights? If not, who decides which should have higher priority? What do we do if stakeholders don't agree? If a group of people is considered to be a stakeholder, do they all have a voice, or is a spokesperson to be elected or nominated? And finally, how do we discount requirements collected from a stakeholder who's clearly confused? So identifying stakeholders starts with listing those who may have a stake in the project and then has a number of activities. First, we need to ensure that there's a business owner. Then we identify all candidate stakeholders, that is, anyone who is affected by the system or able to affect it. We then evaluate those candidates and from them select the stakeholders. We understand the roles, responsibilities and interrelationships of the stakeholders and the stakeholder groups. For each group we identify a representative, an individual. We then prioritise the stakeholders, develop stakeholder management strategies, and finally wrap all that up and include it in a stakeholder management plan. Let's start with the business owner. In the context of a particular system development, someone must have sufficient authority to be able to endorse the stakeholder management plan, to confirm stakeholder representatives, to agree priorities, and so on. They must also have sufficient authority to settle any disputes between parties and to arbitrate and to decide. Without such an owner of the process, very few of the necessary trade-offs will be able to be made during the requirements engineering process. The business owner is also commonly referred to as the project champion. They may also represent a group of individuals who would form a stakeholder board with the business owner as chair. We might therefore call the business owner the chief stakeholder. In this role, the business owner does a number of things. First, they nominate stakeholders. They allocate rights and priorities. They manage the elicitation process. They arbitrate any conflict and make hard decisions where necessary. They provide the conduit between the business, in the business case, and the project, particularly the requirements engineering effort. They negotiate resources on behalf of the project, protect the project against any vagaries in the business environment, and manage stakeholder and business expectations. The first activity in identifying candidate stakeholders is to list all those who may be perceived or who may perceive themselves to have a stake in the system and the project which will bring it into being. Where possible, we identify them by type. That is, we group them in accordance with common interest and common requirements. So let's look at some examples. Imagine that you and your partner are building your own home. So, who would be stakeholders? Well, here is a list of potential stakeholders and let's examine them. First, you and your partner. Well, assuming that you and your partner are the joint mortgage holders, it's difficult to imagine that any other candidate stakeholder has the right to dictate to you any aspect of the system design. So in this case, the business owners, you and your partner, are clearly stakeholders because it's your money. Having said that, of course the money actually comes from the bank. So does that make the bank a stakeholder? Well, despite the fact that the bank will invariably hold the mortgage and therefore will have significant power over you and your house, it's not a stakeholder. It does not have the right to dictate any aspect of the house design. Since it does dictate the budgetary limit of your aspirations, they quite clearly provide a number of external constraints on the project, but they are not stakeholders and you will not engage with them during the project, providing you don't default on your mortgage or need to apply to exceed its current limit. Well, what about your children? Well, you'll certainly take them into account. They will have rights, but those rights are significantly moderated by your desires and, of course, your budget. In some cases, such as the right to choose the colour of their room, you may give them limited stakeholder rights, but you're not likely to do that when deciding on the inclusion of a swimming pool. What about in-laws? Well, you're also unlikely to give your in-laws the right to dictate too many requirements of the system. However, should an aged parent be occupying the house with you, you may give them similar rights to the children with regard to the layout of their room and indeed the way in which the room is constructed if you're building from scratch. Additionally, should you have an in-law who is limited by their physical ability in some way, you might place increased emphasis on access requirements. But none of this makes them a stakeholder unless you give them some limited rights. Local government. Well, like the bank, the local government regulations will place significant constraints on the house design, its location on the block, the utilities it will access and so on. The ability to impose regulatory constraints does not make somebody a stakeholder, however. Their principal act will therefore be to provide a source of constraints. It should be noted, however, that this is not the case in all respects. Neighbours have a joint ownership of a common fence, for example, so they are stakeholders in that aspect of the project, and that right comes from local government regulation. So, speaking of neighbours, they're mostly constraints. They are stakeholders in that limited aspect of the fence, but that doesn't make them stakeholders in your entire project. Their principal impact, if any, will be as a source of constraints. The builder, subcontractors, well, similarly, they're constraints, not stakeholders. Although, for example, you may be purchasing your home from a developer builder and you've arranged some form of discount on the purchase price in return for allowing the builder to use your home as a display home for a short period. In that case, the builder may become a stakeholder with limited rights because they've purchased those rights from you. Similarly with architects and draftsmen, they have considerable interest in the success of the project because their reputation will suffer if the building falls down or even looks awful when it's completed. This interest in the success of the project doesn't make them a stakeholder, however. Their skill, their availability, their interest and their enthusiasm are again constraints. Well, let's look at another project. What about a project to install a local area network within the premises of a small business? Here are the candidate stakeholders, who are genuine stakeholders. Well, first, the business owner is clearly a stakeholder. They have the right to influence the system. It is, after all, their money. The financial manager will no doubt have requirements with regard to expenditure spread, financial guidelines and milestones. Whilst these constraints must be taken into account, that doesn't make the financial manager automatically a stakeholder. Similarly, the operations manager will impose constraints regarding timing of work, disruption to existing business and cutover dates, but they're not automatically a stakeholder. Employees, well, they're undoubtedly affected by the system, but they're also not naturally stakeholders unless they're given the right to dictate some requirements, for example, perhaps the location of some of the peripherals. The building manager, well, the building manager has to be consulted, but subsequent requirements are constraints. The manager does not own the business nor take any part in it, and so they're not a stakeholder. Now, in these last two examples, it was sort of obvious at the outset who was the business owner, that is the project champion. Let's now look at a project that has greater scope, and in particular, one in which the chief stakeholder is not quite so obvious. Imagine, for example, a project such as the Hubble Space Telescope. Here are a list of potential stakeholders: astronomers, manufacturing company, National Space Agency, launching company, operating company, and politicians. Now, of those, the astronomers are the group that drives the principal requirements for the telescope, yet they're not paying for it. They're not even involved in its provision. And further, the project can't engage with all astronomers worldwide, so someone must be available to speak with authority on behalf of the astronomers. To understand the remainder of the candidate stakeholders, we'd need to look in considerably more detail at who's actually providing the funding, who's driving the effort. Is it an initiative driven by the Space Agency, the government, or perhaps a joint venture of some sort? It's clear who the candidate stakeholders are, but it's not always clear who the actual stakeholders are. And so almost all the time in all projects, some considerable investigation is required to identify who are the actual stakeholders. Now let's look at an example where the stakeholder mix is even more eclectic. What about the stakeholders for a new family payment? Well, in most public service projects, there are a very large number of candidate stakeholders. I've listed here the major groupings: families, politicians, taxpayers, relevant government departments, other government departments, and other programs. Now, as well as there being a large number of stakeholders, they also overlap to a considerable extent. Some families will be recipients of the payments, which will ultimately be funded by taxpayers, who are actually families, guided by politicians and members of relevant government departments, who are also taxpayers and also have families. Some of those latter people will be responsible for the programs that will be affected by this program. So to summarise the last four examples, you'll probably have made a mental note already as to which sort of project is more likely to come in on time and on budget. And clearly, as we know in project management, if there's not a project champion, the project is going to struggle to succeed. So those projects which are within some confined level of responsibility, such as a business owner within their business, those projects have a much easier path in selecting stakeholders and defining requirements. The broader the group of stakeholders, the broader the ranges of interest, the more difficult it is to collect those requirements. The other lesson to observe is that regardless of the nature of the project, we need to identify candidate stakeholders and then to evaluate each to determine whether they're a genuine stakeholder or whether they're simply an actor in the system, or whether they are placing constraints on the system in terms of the way it should operate or the manner in which it is to be deployed. So again, it must be emphasised that anyone on our list of candidates is important and we will engage with them. The crucial difference lies in what we make of their contribution. Stakeholders have the right to influence the system requirements, so it's from them that we allow opinions as to what the system should do and how it would perform. Others, such as operators and maintainers, are sources of constraints, rather than considering them as stakeholders. We take them into account, but we need to take them into account in terms of what they say as constraints, not what opinions they might have as stakeholders. Once we've defined the type of stakeholders and selected representatives, we must understand the roles and responsibilities of each group and how they interact. This understanding is essential to guide the requirements engineering process in aspects such as requirements solicitation, generation, trade studies, and so on. It's also an essential precursor to the prioritisation of stakeholders. We can't possibly engage with all stakeholders of a certain type because we don't have the time, and we'll be at the mercy of such a large number of opinions. We must therefore identify appropriate representatives who can speak on behalf of that stakeholder community. It's from these representatives that we elicit requirements and from whom we seek input necessary for requirements analysis and negotiation. Since their input to the system lifecycle is crucial, careful selection of appropriate representatives is therefore very important. In addition to being able to contribute to the requirement solicitation process, it's very important that each representative is supportive and powerful, or at least within their community. This individual must be accepted by the group as their spokesperson, that is, they must be able to speak with authority on behalf of the group. So ideally, a suitable stakeholder representative must be able to understand the business domain and the particular application area within that domain. They must understand the specific problem. They must understand systems engineering, requirements engineering, and engineering. They must understand the associated technology. They must faithfully represent the requirements of their community. They must be supportive of the system and the requirements definition process. They must be powerful, at least within their community, and they must have time to be able to contribute where required to the process. Clearly, the success of the requirements engineering process, particularly the elicitation and generation, will depend heavily on the careful selection of stakeholder representatives. Even then, since there are not likely to be too many stakeholders that possess all of the attributes we saw before, a period of training and education will be required at the beginning of every project to ensure that stakeholders are aware of the requirements engineering processes that we're going to implement. Stakeholder management works best when everyone involved in the process understands their place. That is, they understand how important their opinion is in the scheme of things. Stakeholders should therefore be grouped into categories, and the rights of each category should be made explicit in the stakeholder management plan. In particular, requirements analysis is greatly aided if stakeholder inputs are prioritised, because then they can be traded off more easily. Design spaces are much more easily accommodated if some dimensions have more weight than others. Once all stakeholders have been identified and grouped, representatives identified and prioritised, strategies can be developed to maximise stakeholder involvement in the requirements engineering process. Largely, this involves creating a favourable environment by recognising that while there are some technical difficulties with requirements engineering, it's fundamentally a process dominated and driven by humans, and their preconceptions, their prejudices, their agenda, and so on. These soft aspects must be accommodated and managed if the system development is to succeed. So managing stakeholders can be quite difficult. In particular, stakeholders may not always be so supportive of the system. They may have a hidden agenda, and some may have a stranglehold over other individuals and ideas within an organisation. These gatekeepers have the ability to control the way in which a project progresses, and therefore must be actively managed as part of the requirements engineering process. There are a number of stakeholder management strategies. This example from Alan McLucas illustrates that we seek to have all stakeholders who are supportive and powerful. If they're not, we develop strategies to move them from their current position to become supportive and powerful. Perhaps we might use a communication strategy to persuade someone who is powerful but disaffected to become supportive. Or if that's not successful or possible, management could remove the project from within their power base. Or if someone's supportive but not very powerful, management could move the project within their sphere of influence. Now, the stakeholder management plan therefore is prepared and ideally should identify the business owner, list the stakeholders by type, list each stakeholder's priority, identify the representatives, identify their roles and responsibilities, nominate a stakeholder board, and then nominate stakeholder management strategies, although this may be in a separate document or perhaps an annex available only to the principal stakeholder. Well, if you're interested in this and similar topics, you may also be interested in the Capability Systems Centre at UNSW Canberra. The Centre is an independent think tank that offers cutting-edge research and analysis to government, defence and to industry. If you are after more information, please visit our website. You may also be interested in these two texts, System Engineering Practice and Requirements Practice. Both are available in paperback form from the Amazon websites or the publisher Argos Press websites.